All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're taking a guided classroom tour through a typical 1930s summer day to really grasp the deep socioeconomic impacts of the Great Depression. We often talk about the Depression in terms of stock market crashes and massive national unemployment rates, but to truly understand history, you have to look at how it played out on the actual dusty streets of a small town. So we are stepping into the fictional but incredibly accurate world of Maycomb County, Alabama. Now, instead of looking at boring macroeconomics, we're going to examine these complex historical concepts through a completely different lens, the observant, curious eyes of a kid named Scout Finch. And you know why that's so brilliant? Kids don't care about financial jargon. Instead, Scout just observes the raw reality of her world: who actually has shoes, who brings a lunch to school, and who pays their debts in sacks of hickory nuts. Through her daily neighborhood interactions and summer play, we get a front row seat to the incredibly rigid social rules of the era. So here's our syllabus for the journey today. We'll start with morning in stagnant Maycomb, move on to the classroom class hierarchy, look at poverty and rural farmers, explore summer play and town secrets, and wrap up with the Finch family privilege. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Morning in Stagnant Maycomb, focusing on the intense heat and decay. If you were in Maycomb back then, you'd feel it immediately. The oppressive morning heat wasn't just a backdrop. It was this heavy blanket setting the tone for a tired old town absolutely paralyzed by economic hardship. I mean, in rainy weather, the streets literally turned to red slop, and grass grew right on the sidewalks. This chronological roadmap will help us see how the passage of a single day reveals the rigid class hierarchies of the American South. We'll trace the day just like Scout does, experiencing firsthand how the seemingly innocent routines of childhood are completely dictated by the invisible, and sometimes very visible, economic walls dividing the town. It's a visceral, physical decay. You've got this sagging courthouse and men's stiff collars wilting by 9 in the morning. And that's not an accident, right? It perfectly mirrors the town's economic stagnation. The imagery of a sagging courthouse represents the total crumbling of civic and economic strength. The heat is just oppressive, making everything move at a crawl. And that really reflects an economy where progress has completely stalled out. So people just ambled slowly across the dusty square. A day felt like it was 24 hours long, but honestly, there was nowhere to go and no money to buy anything with anyway. And take the Hoover cart, for instance. It's the perfect example of this forced adaptation. Imagine having an automobile, this massive symbol of modern progress, but being so utterly stripped of cash for gas or repairs that you have to hitch a bony mule to it just to get around. It's a really stark visual of a society moving backward. Moving on to Section 2, the classroom class hierarchy. This is where we really see the town versus the country. Think about it, when you gather kids from all over the county and put them in a single room, the harsh economic realities of their home lives just immediately collide. Scout sees this firsthand when her new teacher, Miss Caroline, who is from out of town, completely misreads the unspoken social rules separating the town kids from the struggling rural farm families. Miss Caroline tries to lend a quarter to a student named Walter Cunningham so he can buy lunch. Well, she doesn't realize that a Cunningham will never take anything they can't pay back. Scout tries to explain this, assuming everyone just naturally knows the local hierarchy. To the kids, Walter's lack of shoes and his hookworms tell a complete, obvious story about his rural, poverty-stricken background. All right, Section 3, Poverty and Rural Farmers. We're going to compare the Cunninghams and the Yules. Now, poverty in Maycomb is strictly tiered. It's so easy to look back at the 1930s and think, oh, everyone was just poor. But within that poverty, there was a fierce, definitive class system determining your worth, your pride, and basically how the town treated you. Just look at the stark contrast between the pride and land-tied struggles of the Cunninghams versus the total destitution of the Owls. The Cunninghams are country folks, farmers hit incredibly hard by the economic crash, yet they show up to school in clean, neatly mended shirts. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum are the Owls. Burris Ewell shows up to the first day of school completely filthy, openly defies the teacher, and actually brags about relying on relief checks. Both families are deeply impoverished, for sure, but they belong to entirely different social castes. And through Scout's innocent perspective, we learn how this cashless agricultural economy actually survives day to day. We see it simply by observing how her dad Atticus gets paid by his legal clients. He helps Mr. Cunningham with his entailment. Since Mr. Cunningham is holding on to his land but is totally cash poor, he pays Atticus the only way he can. A load of stovewood, a sack of hickory nuts, a crate of smilax and holly, and a croaker sack full of turnip greens. That is literally how people survived. So this brings up an interesting question I want you to reflect on. How does extreme poverty change the way a community enforces its own laws?
Why do the common folk of Maycomb deliberately turn a blind eye to the Yules hunting out of season and skipping school? Well, Atticus explains to Scout that while hunting out of season is technically a crime, when a man like Bob Yule spends his relief checks on green whiskey, his kids cry from hunger pains. The town bends its own rigid laws because forcing the Yules into a conventional environment is pointless. Quite frankly, the community would rather let them hunt than sit by and watch children starve.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Summer Play and Town Secrets, specifically focusing on the Radley place. As our day shifts into the afternoon, we start to see how neighborhood games reveal all these hidden social tensions and local mysteries. When school is out, the kids' physical boundaries are strictly defined by the calling distance of their cook, Calpurnia. But their imaginations? Those are entirely shaped by the town's social rules. Look at the tired, decaying physical state of the isolated Radley place. It perfectly reflects the ultimate social exclusion in a town where everyone is expected to fit into a neat little category. Just as the town's buildings sag from economic fatigue, the Radley house droops from social isolation. The yard is totally overrun with weeds, representing the family's total disconnect from the community. In a place where everyone knows everyone's business, a closed door is considered an unforgivable offense. So kids like Scout and Jem end up spending their summer playing, interpreting, and basically mimicking these incredibly rigid adult social rules. They learn that the Radleys are outcasts, not just because of some spooky rumors, but because they break the fundamental rules of Maycomb society. They don't go to church, they keep their doors closed on Sundays, and Mrs. Radley never crosses the street for mid-morning coffee. The children absorb all these social expectations and naturally turn them into terrifying neighborhood myths to play out in their front yard. Finally, let's look at Section 5, the Finch family privilege, and their unique position in all of this. Returning home in the evening, we can really see the Finch family's specific privileges and responsibilities within this struggling society. Now, Scout doesn't view her family as wealthy. She actually asks her dad straight up if they're poor. But their position in town is uniquely sheltered compared to their rural neighbors. Looking at this caste system pyramid, we can clearly see the hierarchy separating families and dictating every single interaction in Maycomb. The Finches sit near the top. They're educated, Atticus is a professional lawyer, they live on the main residential street, and they employ Calpurnia. Below them are the Cunninghams, fiercely proud but financially ruined by the agricultural crash. And way down at the very bottom are the Yules, living like outcasts behind the garbage dump. But even with that relative privilege, Atticus explains to his kids that their own economic survival is deeply tied to the failing agricultural economy around them. It's honestly a brilliant, child-friendly explanation of macroeconomic dependency. He tells them, professional people were poor because the farmers were poor. Because Maycomb is farm country, if the farmers can't sell their cotton and have no cash, well then they can't pay the doctors, the dentists, or the lawyers. The town's professionals are poor by extension, linked in an inescapable chain right to the soil. And that brings us to this brief exchange. Are we poor, Atticus? We are indeed. It really captures the heart of this explainer. We're telling the story of a crippled economy entirely through a child trying to make sense of her world. When Atticus simply agrees that they are poor, he acknowledges the harsh reality of the 1930s South, while simultaneously sheltering Scout from the devastating, desperate kind of poverty experienced by folks like the Cunninghams and the Yules. It's an honest, yet incredibly measured reality check. By tracking these daily observations, we viscerally feel how the Great Depression completely paralyzed the American South. Think about it. We didn't need to look at banking ledgers or national statistics today. Instead, we looked at sagging courthouses, kids arriving at school without lunch or shoes, and families forced to pay lawyers with turnip greens. This is how history actually felt to the people living through it. So I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. If a town's physical decay is a direct mirror of its rigid class system, what happens to those social walls when the pressure of poverty becomes too great? Think about what happens when a community is squeezed this tight by economic stagnation. How long can polite society maintain its strict rules before something eventually shatters? Keep that in mind as you explore the source material further. Thank you so much for joining me on this tour of Maycomb, and I will see you next time.